the show. Later this hour, well, in fact, the next hour, we're going to open up the phone lines to hear what you've got to say today. We've got an open hour for you between 11 and 12. And as always, in our open hours, anything goes. So give us a call between 11 and 12 here this morning, 902-405-6000 or 1-877-801-8255. Anything goes in our open hours, and there's lots we can talk about here this morning. But coming up here shortly, we just got to make contact again with Paul. We had him on the line, but somehow something happened, and he's gone. But Katie's just getting back because there's a new article in Maclean's magazine headlined, "The Nova Scotia killer had ties to criminals and withdrew a huge sum of cash before the shooting." And the story reveals that Gabriel Wertman withdrew $475,000 from a Brinks office in Burnside days before his rampage that took the lives of 22 Nova Scotians. Nova Scotia-based author and journalist Paul Palango co-wrote the Maclean's piece. And Paul joins me on the phone here this morning. Mr. Palango, good morning to you.
Good morning to you, Rick.
How you doing this morning, Paul?
It's been sort of a hectic couple of days putting all of this stuff together, but I think we're sort of moving in the right direction now on this story.
No question. Interesting article. Well, let's start where it starts. And Palango withdrew in late April $475,000 in cash just days before he put on that RCMP uniform and started, killing. As it says here, neighbors, contacts, and random strangers. Withdrew the money from the Brinks office in Burnside. What do we know about why he took that money out? What became of that money? What do we know about this, Paul?
Well, we don't know why he took it out or exactly where it comes from, whether he cashed in his assets. If you recall, a couple of days ago, they had details of his will, where he said he had $1.2 million in assets, $700,000 of it, which was in the assessed value of his properties that he owned, and the other $500,000 was in RRSPs and other assets. So we don't know if he cashed in those or he had a secret stash of cash. But he took the $500,000 out, or not, $475,000 out, and demanded that it seemed that he wanted it quickly. It was in $100 bills, and then he wanted it Brinks to deliver it, but then he wanted to pick it up at Brinks or whatever. It's an unusual sort of situation, but he picked it up at Brinks.
Yeah, and again, what became of the money? I understand that the lawyer in this class action lawsuit that was filed this week believes that the RCMP might still have that money. What do we know about this? I
think Wertman was, carrying the money around with him. It's not, you think $475,000 would be a lot of cash, but in $100 bills, it works out to, about 8 liters, equivalent of 8 liters. You can put it in a sort of a carry bag. It only weighs about 10 or 11 pounds, or 5 kg. So I think he was carrying it right to the end, and I think the police have it.
But they haven't revealed that, have they?
Well, Rick, the police haven't revealed very much at all. They basically tell us what we probably already know. That's what they've been doing, and that's part of the problem.
But again, we don't know what he was using with that money other than he was in a carry-all, basically. You're right, $100 bills, and he was just carrying it with him, basically.
Well, we could speculate on why he had the money. Was he, there are suggestions he was paranoid, he was worried about COVID, was he cashing out and taking the money and basically going to ride things out? I don't know why he was carrying it around with him. I mean, there's also the speculation, and there's lots of room for speculation here because the RCMP is basically not telling us anything. Or was he, on the other end of the story where we talked about him possibly being a confidential informant, was he trying to buy his safety because his cover had been blown?
Yeah.
We don't know.
Yeah. Again, one of the mysteries that perhaps a public inquiry might shed some light on, huh?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's absolutely a need for a public inquiry here. And one of the real problems we have is that at the provincial level, we have Mark Furry, an ex-RCMP staff sergeant, overseeing an investigation into a heinous series of crimes and an absolutely abysmal performance by the RCMP. And he's the person supposedly looking after the RCMP, and it's well known that he's buddies with the guys at the top of the RCMP. That's a fact. And then you look at the federal level. you have Bill Blair, another former policeman, police chief of Toronto, is in charge of the Solicitor General's office overseeing police. I mean, one of the problems in this country is that, there's all kinds of questions being raised about the performance of police and reforms in policing and whatever, and governments at both levels and in other provinces as well have found it wise to appoint former policemen to be in charge of the police. How can we expect a fair sort of disinterested approach to this serious problem?
Your article also, you told us about Peter Allen Griffin last week when we talked here, the neighbor of Wortman's imported pick, linked to the a Mexican drug cartel and the Hells Angels. And your article, this new one in Maclean's, reveals that he printed the decals that Wortman used on his replica RCMP cruiser. Tell us more about this.
Well, first of all, Rick, I want to thank you for giving me the time last week to basically raise these issues because, the money I raised, the issue of the money, I didn't know what happened. The Peter Allen Griffin I raised, and people in your audience responded as I'd asked them to, and it was very, very helpful. So what Griffin did, Griffin was, it's come to me actually in the last, since the article came out last night, that he's a longtime friend of Wortman's, and since he got out of prison in Alberta, he was working as Wortman's handyman and basically doing a number of things with him, working closely, was a drinking buddy of his, and he worked at a sign shop. And that Griffin, this guy with serious organized crime sort of ties, was the guy who applied the decals to the fake RCMP car that was used in the rampage.
So he were working at a printing shop, so he printed up these decals without the knowledge of the business's proprietor, right? Basically did this on his own.
Yeah, no, I don't think he printed them up. I think they purchased them and he applied them because you need some sort of laser technology to do it. And he did that. The owner didn't know what was going on because it was done after hours.
Yeah, and again, Griffin, Peter Allen Griffin, who is again, it's hard to put all this together here, but he and one of the victims' mothers, his mother and one of the victims' mothers are sisters. So there's another connection there.
Yeah, this is another question. In fact, I've got to correct that. I was correct. 11 o'clock last night, I was contacted by someone who'd been trying to reach me for a week and hadn't been able to find me, and they finally found me after they saw the Maclean story last night, and told me that Griffin, although it appears in obituaries, because it's so difficult to find information because nobody wants to talk because it got the RCMP on one side, and a lot of people are sort of afraid of the RCMP for whatever reason, and you've got the Hells Angels on the other side. People are really, really reluctant to talk, but this person called and said there's an error in the story, and I admit there is an error now, that Griffin's mother is actually the cousin of the person that she's reported to be the sister of. And so Sean McLeod, the jail guard in Spring Hill, is actually the second cousin of Griffin, although they were raised as cousins.
Yeah,
so technically they're second cousins.
I also heard that McLeod's partner, Alana Jenkins, who was also murdered by Wortman, was at one time Wortman's former girlfriend.
I'm not familiar with that because I haven't really spent that much time on Wortman because, as you know, like through the Halifax Examiner, I was exploring sort of the RCMP side of the story while everyone was chasing Wortman, and then I got to the point where the two stories converge. And so I've only recently come over to the Wortman side.
Yeah, but he did spend several hours at their home after he killed the couple, right? Killed McLeod and Jenkins. And we don't know what he was doing there yet, do we?
No, he spent 3 hours there. We know he didn't have a cell phone. Was he calling people? Was he, nobody really knows. I mean, according to the obituaries, Alana Jenkins was died before McLeod. I don't know how they know this or what's going on. That's never been revealed, and it seems that McLeod was his target.
Boy, again, this just gets More and more questions that need answers here. One of the other things that the RCMP said at their last update was that Wortman, in his replica RCMP car, did not pull over the two VON nurses in their separate vehicles, which led me to wonder at the time, then how did he kill them? But his class action lawsuit suggests that the family members dispute the RCMP account of that. What do you know about this situation, Paul?
Other than what I've seen, from the poor performance of the RCMP in this, I mean, they've had a number of misstatements in their public messaging from the beginning, and they've been obviously hiding something, and this has led to all kinds of conjecture because of it's obvious there's something being hidden here. I mean, from the outset, one of the first comments I ever made was about the poor response and how a corporal who showed up at the scene essentially froze. I think the third Mountie to arrive at the scene froze and was supposed to be in charge. Well, I had a Mountie call me last night and who was close to the scene and said, in fact, the corporal not only froze but got out of her car, turned off her flashlight, and hid in the woods. And this is from a serving Mountie.
Wow.
Telling me this, and I don't disbelieve it because it basically confirms what I've been saying all along, that the chaos at the scene, the original scene, is just remarkably unprofessional. And there are insights I'd have that I'd like to help the families with and help their case. I have people who have actually come forward who want to help the families from the RCMP community because they're so disgusted.
Well, the families of at least two of the victims killed in that rampage have decided now to go the next step. They are launching a class action lawsuit against the RCMP, saying that the Mounties failed to protect their loved ones from the gunman. And we'll hear more about that when we come back after this break. Paul Palango is my guest. He's the co-author of a piece in Maclean's magazine. He and Stephen Marr wrote this piece, and we'll hear more about it when we come back after this quick break. Coming up to 10:49, Paul Palango, my guest. He co-authored a new article in Maclean's magazine, headlined, "The Nova Scotia Killer Had Ties to Criminals and Withdrew a Huge Sum of Cash Before the Shooting." Paul, as you know, a couple of family members of some of the victims have now filed a class action lawsuit claiming that the RCMP failed to protect their loved ones from the gunman. It alleges that even though the RCMP knew that Wortman had a prior history of violence, he was on the loose. They failed to protect the public from the shooter and failed to adequately warn the public about the active shooter situation, something you've told us in many occasions in the past. But I want to ask you about one piece of information that came out of this class action, and that is at least one family had their car, the victim, returned to the family with shell casings and pieces of human still in it. How outrageous is that? How could that be, Paul? Why would this be allowed to happen?
Well, the RCMP, and I've been saying this for years, and I know there are people who call in and say I'm a nutcase. I've heard them. I'm not a nutcase. I actually know what I'm talking about. The RCMP, in its own reports, its own reporting, its own sort of the consultants it hires say this is a dysfunctional operation with a broken culture. That's words from their own reports, and outsiders who have studied it in the last couple of years come to much the same conclusion. They're just serious lapses in the ability of this force to perform in the public interest. And they seem to have lost sight of who they are and what they should be doing. I mean, nothing surprises me, unfortunately. I mean, when I did my first piece in Maclean's last month, I said the Nova Scotia shooting encapsulates all that is wrong with the RCMP. Well, little did I know all this other stuff was going to happen since then that sort of it's breathtaking how dysfunctional the force is. And it's also equally breathtaking that you could have politicians like the Premier of Nova Scotia and the Justice Minister of Nova Scotia standing back saying, we're going to let the RCMP investigate itself. Yeah. I mean, this is just diabolically stupid.
But how lack of what a lack of compassion to turn a car back over to the family and say, you clean it. I mean,
well, that's right, yeah. Absolutely. But the RCMP has basically lost touch with the communities it's policing. I mean, it's just going through. It seems to be just going through the motions of performing its job, and it's sort of lost. It's like the old line about the what do they call it? The Irish setter, lost at the end of its leash. It doesn't know what it's doing. It doesn't know what it's supposed to be doing. And that's the crisis in policing we face right now, and then politicians have to wake up to that.
Yeah. You've talked with a number of, as you point out, current and former police officers for this article, and some have suggested that they're suspicious about the motives, you write, behind the delay in calling an inquiry. Elaborate on that for me here. What is their suspicion? That's
a key thing that... if you look at this as Wortman was just a crazy guy, which the RCMP keeps focusing on, saying it was a fluid and chaotic scene, and this crazy guy planned all this out. You don't have to tell me or the public that Gabriel Wortman was a crazy guy. I know that. That he acted the way he did. Okay, now we're 9 weeks down the road. What has happened? We haven't been told any useful information about this. The RCMP has not laid any charges against anyone in this, for the guns that were found, et cetera, the decals on the car. And my police sources say one of the reasons they've done this is because they don't want to create files that basically will be found out and explain what's going on. So you have to ask yourself, what's going on? And I keep coming back to, and other police people are now coming back to, the fact that Wortman was some sort of confidential informant for the RCMP involved in the biker world. He had Griffin at his side, who was a biker, notorious biker, who appears to have had Hells Angels sort of connections and approvals from both people I've talked to in the community and police. But there are other biker-related things that all through this story that just don't make sense, and not the least of them being the whole timing of this thing sort of coincides beginning back in February, and the descent into craziness of Wortman coincides with a series of raids on the Hells Angels in Fairview, Spryfield, Halifax, and in New Brunswick. What's going on? There's something in there, and the last part of this is that in the previous conversation, remember I linked this to New Brunswick. I said, this is all being run out of New Brunswick. After putting that on your show, I had a number of people come forward and say, in the policing community, saying this all relates to New Brunswick, RCMP basically taking over all biker operations last fall. And there are a number of serious things happened during that period when everything was moved under the direction of New Brunswick. I mean, some Mounties have said we should be looking into, and the public, the media and public should be looking into the tragic suicide of a staff sergeant named Bruce Reed on October 25th.
In New Brunswick.
In New Brunswick, that he had the background to be involved in something like this. And the suggestion is something went horribly bad, and he couldn't take it anymore. We don't know, but I think that we're going to need some help here, like we did last week. Last week I appealed. I asked about the money. I asked about Griffin. People came back. Well, right now, you know who I'm going to ask for help from?
Who?
The Hells Angels.
What do you want to hear from the Hells Angels?
Well, it's a funny thing that I want to know if they had contact with Wortman. Let's put this thing to bed. And people will say, well, why would you contact the Hells Angels? It's funny that Maclean's managing editor, Charlie Gillis, who I've written about in the past in another context, I was running this past him the other day, and he says when he was in Alberta, the Hells Angels actually had their own public relations guy to deal with the media on media questions. And the suggestion that's sort of like a wildfire growing under the RCMP, that there was a connection to the Hells Angels. Well, why don't they get a hold of me? We could sort of work it out, or get a hold of your favorite reporter, and we can work it out and find out, was there a connection? And let's explore this, because it's not going to hurt the Hells Angels. Or it puts this whole notion to bed for once and for all, and we can move on.
What about asking the RCMP, was Gabriel Wortman a confidential informant? Have they been asked that question?
Well, I think they have been asked. The problem is a confidential informant has a promise of anonymity even in death. However, you've asked a good question, because in my story in Maclean's, I refer to a Form 2315. A Form 2315 is something the Mounties will send about to the top, to the Deputy of Operations in Ottawa, about any project or major investigation they're undertaking. And in those, I'm led to believe that by Mounties on the inside, that in these forums, the Mounties actually talk candidly about what's going on and what the situation is. And I think that as citizens and journalists, we should start pursuing these Forms 2315s and finding out what is in them regarding either the Hells Angels or this whole, massacre that's taken place. But I think that's where the key lies, where what they're hiding is in those forums. And I would encourage people to sort of start asking politicians, start to push to find out what's going on.
Well, it sounds like there's a whole lot more information to be learned about all of this still to come yet. And Paul, I appreciate, again, your time here this morning.
Can I say one last thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm doing this, like people say, I've heard commenters come on the radio and say, oh, you're doing this for the money. Well, you can ask the Halifax Examiner how much money I got for the 5 pieces I wrote.
Yeah.
I'm not in it for the money. I'm in it because I'm a citizen. I'm looking at this as an important public interest story. I run my own business. My wife has health issues. I have my own issues I have to deal with. I'm doing this because I believe in the public interest. I believe in the story. And I think there's others who have to do this as well. Get off the couches and start asking your politicians and demanding that we find out what happens. Don't just sit there and wait, because nothing will happen.
Paul, appreciate your time here this morning. We'll talk again.
Thank you.
All the
Anytime.
best. Hey, take care. Paul Palango, Nova Scotia-based author and a journalist. And the show later this hour, well, in fact, the next hour, we're going to open up the phone lines to hear what you've got to say today. We've got an open